He is on camera. He is there one moment, alive, moving, talking, laughing, blending into the noise of a crowded spring break night. Then he steps out of frame near a bar entrance in Columbus, Ohio. After that, Brian Randall Shaffer is gone. No confirmed sighting. No proven exit caught on the main camera. No call home that explains anything. Just a 27-year-old medical student who seems to vanish at the exact point a normal night should have been ending. Before we continue, thousands of people watch these cases and never subscribe. Then the algorithm buries the update, the next documentary, the next missing person whose name still deserves to be heard. We release cases daily at 7:30 p.m., and subscribing helps keep these stories alive. So please, subscribe, turn on notifications, and comment your location below. It takes 1 second, and in a case like Brian Shaffer's, attention still matters. Brian Randall Shaffer was not the kind of person people expected to disappear. He was bright, outgoing, and deeply familiar to the people around him. Friends described him as funny and charismatic. He was studying medicine at Ohio State University, and by the spring of 2006, he was already well on the road to becoming a doctor. He had completed his undergraduate degree in microbiology and moved into medical school, where the pressure was heavy, but the future still looked wide open. He grew up in Pickerington, just outside Columbus, with his parents Randy and Renee and his younger brother Derek. By the time he was in medical school, Brian had built the kind of life people point to as proof that someone is headed somewhere. He was in a serious relationship with fellow medical student Alexis Waggoner. The two were planning a trip to Miami for spring break. People close to them believed Brian was likely thinking seriously about marriage. But beneath that picture of progress, there was grief. Only weeks before Brian disappeared, his mother Renee died after battling myelodysplasia. People who knew Brian said he was trying to hold himself together. He had classes, exams, plans, expectations. On the surface, he looked like he was functioning. But loss like that does not move in a straight line. It sits in the room with you, even when you are smiling. Brian also had another side to him, one that made him feel more human and less like a resume. He loved music. He loved Pearl Jam. Friends said he sometimes talked about a more relaxed life, something far away from pressure and routine, maybe even starting a band and living somewhere tropical. That detail would matter later, because once someone disappears, every dream they ever mentioned gets pulled back into the light and examined like evidence. March 31st, 2006, was supposed to feel like release. Spring break had started. Brian had been pushing himself hard academically. His father later said he seemed exhausted, worn down from studying and staying up late. Earlier that evening, Brian and Randy had dinner together at a steakhouse. It was an ordinary father and son moment, the kind nobody realizes might become the last complete memory. After dinner, Brian still planned to go out. He linked up with his friend William Clint Florence. The night began at the ugly Tuna Saloona, a bar near the Ohio State campus in the South Campus Gateway complex. According to later accounts, the two spent the evening bar hopping, moving through different spots, drinking, and making the most of the beginning of break. At one point, Brian called Alexis, who was away visiting family before their planned trip. Nothing in that call sounded like a goodbye. Nothing sounded final. As the night stretched into early morning, they met up with Meredith Reed, a friend of Florence. She later drove them back to the ugly Tuna Saloona. Security footage captured them entering the bar area around 1:15 in the morning. That detail is important because from this point on, the case becomes a timeline built almost minute by minute, trying to understand how a person can be visible and then simply not be there anymore. Inside the bar, nothing in the public record suggests open panic or immediate danger. Brian appeared to be having a normal night out. He was seen socializing. Near closing time, he was outside the bar entrance talking briefly with two women. This was at about 1:55 in the morning. The interaction looked casual, ordinary. Just one more moment in a crowded nightlife setting where nobody thinks they are standing next to the last verified seconds of a missing person's known life. Then Brian moved out of camera view. That is the hinge this entire case turns on. He is seen outside the bar area. He steps away, and after that, there is no confirmed footage of him leaving through the main escalator exit. Years later, one of the original investigators would say that after reviewing the footage extensively, he was certain Brian did not leave by that route. That statement only made the mystery harder, because if he did not leave the way everyone else did, then where did he go? When the bar closed around 2 in the morning, Florence and Reed could not find him. They tried calling. They searched. They waited outside as patrons poured out. Brian was not among them. Eventually, they assumed he had left on his own and gone back to his apartment without telling them. That assumption makes sense in ordinary life. Friends get separated. Phones die. People head home. It happens every weekend in every city. But in this case, that ordinary assumption opened the door to lost time investigators would never get back. The next day, concern started to build. Alexis called Brian, but his phone went to voicemail. At first, that was not enough to trigger panic. He had been out late. Maybe he was asleep. Maybe he was recovering from the night before. But as hours turned into another day, the silence stopped feeling normal. Randy had not heard from him either. Then came the moment that changed concern into alarm. Brian missed the flight to Miami. He and Alexis had plans. He did not show. That was not like him. By then, police were notified, and what had looked like a simple missed call became a missing person case. The first place investigators focused on was the ugly Tuna Saloona and the surrounding Gateway complex. The area had security cameras, which should have helped. In most disappearances, the hardest part is finding the last place a person was definitely seen. In Brian's case, police had that. They had timestamps. They had footage. They had a building. But the cameras did not solve the mystery. They deepened it. There was the main escalator entrance used by patrons, but there was also a service route nearby. That route led toward a construction area and another possible exit. Investigators considered whether Brian could have gone that way instead. Some believed it would have been difficult, especially if he was intoxicated. Others noted that the camera coverage there was imperfect. One camera panned. Another was manually operated. So even in a building with surveillance, there were still blind spots. And blind spots are where theories begin to breed. Police widened the search fast. They looked around nearby streets, dumpsters, and surrounding blocks. Officers checked local hospitals and shelters. Search efforts expanded toward the Olentangy River and other areas around campus. Brian's apartment was checked. His car was still parked there. Inside, there was no sign he had come home in a rush, packed up, or planned to vanish. The scene did not look staged. It looked interrupted, as if a life had simply paused in the middle of itself. Flyers went up. His name spread. People were told to look for a tall young man with brown hair, hazel eyes, and distinctive features including a tattoo and a small fleck in one iris. In missing person cases, details like that become sacred. They are repeated over and over because they are what loved ones have left to hold on to. Not answers, just identifiers, fragments, something the world might recognize if he is out there somewhere. And this is where the case starts to shift from troubling to haunting. Because investigators were not dealing with a person who disappeared on an empty road or in a remote field. Brian vanished in a lively entertainment district, near closing time, in an area where other people were present and where cameras existed. There should have been a clean line from point A to point B. Instead, the line breaks. He is there on the footage. Then the footage stops making sense. That single gap changed everything. If Brian walked away on his own, how did nobody clearly see him leave? If something happened inside or near that building, how did it happen without producing a witness, a body, or an obvious trail? If he used a service exit, what happened once he got outside? And if he met with foul play, why has nothing definitive surfaced in all the years since? These are not dramatic questions added later by documentaries. They were built into the case from the beginning. The theories began almost immediately. Some believed he was harmed after leaving by an unseen route. Some thought he could have fallen victim to a random act of violence. Others looked at his recent grief, the pressure of school, and his occasional island daydream talk, and wondered whether he chose to leave his old life behind. Law enforcement never publicly embraced one single explanation. What made the case so powerful was not just that Brian disappeared. It was that every explanation seemed to leave something unanswered. And then there was the emotional cruelty of timing. Brian vanished just after his mother's death. His father, already devastated, was suddenly thrown into a second nightmare. Alexis went from preparing for a spring break trip with the man she loved to helping search for him. His brother Derek was left trying to make sense of the last conversations they had. In cases like this, the mystery is not only what happened to the missing person, it is also what happens to everyone forced to live inside the uncertainty. Years later, official agencies would still keep Brian's case active. The FBI continued to list him as missing. NamUs preserved the case details. In 2021, Ohio authorities released an age-progressed image, a quiet but painful acknowledgement that time had moved forward even without answers. Brian had disappeared at 27. The image asked the public to imagine him older, still somewhere, still unresolved. But back in those first days, none of that existed yet. There was only the surveillance footage, the silence, the missed trip, the untouched apartment, and the growing realization that this was not going to be a simple case of a young man sleeping off a long night. Something had happened between 1:55 in the morning and the rest of his life. And nobody could say, with certainty, what it was. That is what makes Brian Shaffer's case so disturbing. Not just that he disappeared, but that he disappeared from a place that should have forced the truth into view. Instead, the truth stepped out of frame with him. Comment below. Do you believe Brian left that building alive? Or do you think the key to this case has always been inside the bar complex? The moment Brian Randall Shaffer was officially reported missing, the case should have followed a familiar path. Identify the last confirmed sighting, trace movements, interview witnesses, pull surveillance, build a timeline, close the gaps. But this case didn't follow that path. Because the timeline did not expand, it collapsed. Investigators began where Brian was last seen, the ugly Tuna Saloona, inside the South Campus Gateway complex near Ohio State University. This was not an isolated bar tucked away in a quiet corner. It was part of a busy entertainment area. There were people everywhere that night. Music, noise, movement, and cameras that should have made things easier. Instead, it made everything harder. Police pulled the surveillance footage immediately. They traced Brian's movements from when he entered the building around 1:15 in the morning with Clint Florence and Meredith Reed. They confirmed he was inside. They confirmed he was socializing. They confirmed he stepped outside briefly near closing time and spoke to two women around 1:55. Then they watched what should have been the simplest part of the investigation. Everyone leaving. The bar closed at 2 in the morning. People began to pour out. Groups moved toward the escalator exit. Footage captured dozens of individuals coming and going. But not Brian. They watched again. Still not Brian. They slowed the footage, replayed it, cross-checked angles, compared timestamps. Nothing. One of the original investigators would later say that after extensive review, he could say with complete certainty that Brian did not leave via the main escalator. That statement turned what could have been a routine disappearance into something deeply unsettling. Because if he didn't leave the way everyone else did, then what happened? Investigators turned to the possibility of alternative exits. There was a service door near where Brian had last been seen. It was not meant for public use. It led into a hallway connected to a construction area. From there, it was theoretically possible to reach another exit. But this raised more questions than answers. Would Brian, who had been drinking, even think to use that route? Would he be able to navigate it in that condition? Would anyone else have seen him? And if he did leave that way, what was waiting on the other side? The cameras in that area were not reliable. One panned continuously. Another required manual operation. There were gaps. Moments where something could happen and not be recorded. Those gaps became the center of the investigation. Police expanded outward. They pulled footage from nearby bars, streets, and businesses. They tried to reconstruct a wider movement pattern. If Brian had exited through any visible route, another camera should have picked him up somewhere. None did. No footage showed him walking down the street. No footage showed him entering another building. No footage showed him getting into a car. It was as if he had been erased between frames. Witness interviews began immediately. Clint Florence, who had spent the night with Brian, told investigators about their movements. The bar hopping, the drinks, the return to the ugly Tuna Saloona. Meredith Reed confirmed the same sequence. Both said they lost track of Brian inside the bar before closing. They called him. They looked for him. They waited outside. Then they assumed he had gone home. That assumption would follow them for years. The two women Brian spoke to outside the bar were eventually identified. Their interaction with him had been brief, casual. There was no indication of conflict, no sign of distress, no argument, nothing that would suggest the moment carried any hidden weight, which made it worse. Because if the last known interaction is normal, then the disappearance must have happened immediately after. And that narrows the window. Investigators searched the building itself. Every accessible space, every corridor, every possible blind spot. They checked restrooms, storage areas, maintenance access points. Nothing. They expanded the search outside. Officers combed the streets around the Gateway complex. They checked dumpsters, alleyways, nearby lots. They used police dogs to trace scent trails. Nothing. The search moved further out, toward the Olentangy River, toward surrounding neighborhoods, toward any place Brian could have walked within a short time frame. Still nothing. At Brian's apartment, located just a few blocks away, everything remained untouched. His car was parked outside. There were no signs he had returned. No evidence of packing. No indication he had planned to leave town. His life was still there, waiting. That detail pushed investigators into uncomfortable territory. If Brian did not go home, if he did not leave through the main exit, if no camera captured him elsewhere, then the possibilities begin to narrow in ways that don't sit well. Either something happened inside or immediately around that building, or Brian managed to leave in a way that completely bypassed every expected path. Both options were difficult to prove, and both came with problems. Police began to consider foul play. The area around campus was not free from crime. Late-night environments come with risk, but there were no signs of a struggle, no reports of violence, no witnesses who saw anything suspicious unfold. Then came the theory of accident. Could Brian have fallen somewhere? Into a construction area? Into a space that hadn't been properly searched? Teams went back. They searched again. Still nothing. Then came the theory that always appears in cases like this. Voluntary disappearance. Brian had recently lost his mother. He had been under academic pressure. He had talked about wanting a different kind of life. A more relaxed one. Music. Travel. Escape. Was it possible he simply walked away? At first, that theory seems clean. Simple. Even comforting in a strange way. But then the details begin to push back. He left behind his car. He left behind his belongings. He missed a planned trip he had been looking forward to. He stopped communicating with everyone who knew him. No financial activity. No confirmed sightings. No identity trail. Disappearing intentionally is one thing. Erasing yourself completely is another. And then something happened that complicated things even further. In the months after Brian vanished, his girlfriend Alexis continued calling his phone, night after night, sometimes just to hear the voicemail, sometimes hoping, irrationally but understandably, that he might pick up. Then one night, months later, the phone rang. Not voicemail. It rang. 3 times. She called again, and again. Each time, it rang before going silent. That moment hit like a shockwave, because a ringing phone suggests presence. It suggests connection. It suggests the possibility that Brian, or someone with his phone, was still out there. Phone records later indicated a signal ping from a tower in Hilliard, several miles from Columbus. But even that detail refused to settle into clarity. The service provider suggested it could have been a technical glitch, a network error, a delayed signal, something that feels real in the moment but dissolves under scrutiny. So once again, the case moved forward without actually moving forward. Investigators followed leads as they came in. Sightings were reported from different states, even internationally. Each one was checked. Each one faded. Nothing stuck. Nothing held. And slowly, the investigation began to change shape. Not solved. Not closed. Just stretched. The kind of case that sits on desks, gets revisited, gets discussed, gets passed from one set of hands to another, but never fully resolves. And inside that unresolved space, attention shifted toward the people closest to Brian that night. Clint Florence became a point of focus, not because there was clear evidence against him, but because proximity always draws scrutiny. He had been with Brian for most of the night. He was one of the last people to see him. He cooperated with police early on, gave his account, repeated it, but when asked to take a polygraph test, he declined. Legally, that was his right. But in a case like this, where answers are already scarce, refusal becomes something people hold on to. It becomes a question mark. Brian's brother Derek would later say he believed Clint knew more than he had shared. Not necessarily that he was responsible, but that he knew something he hadn't said. Alexis, too, believed there were gaps. Not clear accusations, just the sense that something was missing, and that sense would never fully go away. Meanwhile, law enforcement maintained a more cautious position. They continued to work the case, continued to review evidence, continued to accept tips, but they did not publicly confirm a suspect. They did not announce a breakthrough. They held on to 3 main theories, but they never fully revealed them. And that silence created something else. Speculation. Theories began to spread outside official channels. Some linked Brian's case to larger patterns. Others tried to connect it to unrelated incidents. One of the most widely discussed ideas was the so-called smiley face theory, a theory suggesting a pattern of young men found in bodies of water connected by graffiti symbols. Law enforcement rejected it. The FBI rejected it. There was no evidence linking Brian to that pattern. But once a theory enters the public space, it doesn't leave easily. It becomes part of the story, whether it belongs there or not. And through all of this, one fact never changed. Brian Shaffer walked into a bar. He was seen on camera. He spoke to people. He moved through a crowded environment. And then he disappeared in a way that defied every normal expectation of how people move through space. No clean exit. No confirmed path. No resolution. Just a gap. A missing piece in a timeline that should not have room for one. And as the investigation stalled, something else began to settle in. Time. Days turned into months. Months turned into years. And the question shifted from, "Where is Brian?" to something heavier. What happens when a case never gives you an answer? Comment below. Do you think investigators missed something inside the building that night? Or do you believe Brian made it out and something happened afterward? Time does something strange to cases like this. At first, everything moves fast. Calls, searches, media coverage, posters on walls, police lines stretching across streets, people looking, hoping, expecting that any moment something will break. Then slowly it doesn't, and the case begins to drift. Not because people stop caring, but because there is nothing solid to hold on to. Weeks after Brian Randall Shaffer disappeared, Columbus was still talking about it. His face was everywhere. His name was known. The story had that one detail that refuses to let go of people's minds. A man walks into a bar, and there is no proof he ever walks out. But attention fades faster than mystery. As the weeks turned into months, the investigation lost momentum. Not because police stopped working, but because every lead began to circle back to the same empty point. No confirmed exit, no body, no witness who could say, "I saw what happened." Brian's father, Randy Shaffer, refused to let the case fade quietly. He had already lost his wife. Now he was living inside a second loss, one that didn't even come with the certainty of death. And that kind of loss is different. It doesn't end. It loops. It wakes you up at night. It makes you replay the last conversations over and over again, searching for something you missed. Randy became one of the most visible forces keeping Brian's name alive. He spoke to media. He worked with investigators. He followed leads himself. He even consulted a psychic at one point, desperate for anything that might point him in the right direction. That psychic told him Brian's body was in water near a bridge. So Randy went looking. He, along with Derek and others, spent time searching along the Olentangy River, the same river that runs near the Ohio State campus. They walked the banks. They checked under bridges. They looked in places most people would avoid. But like everything else in this case, nothing. That kind of repeated failure does something to a family. It doesn't just hurt. It changes how you see the world. Every unknown becomes a possibility. Every rumor becomes something you can't fully ignore. And rumors did come. Sightings of Brian began to surface from different places. Michigan, Texas, even overseas. Each one carried a moment of hope. Each one was investigated. Each one led nowhere. Meanwhile, the official investigation continued in the background. Evidence was reviewed again and again. Files grew thicker. Interviews were revisited. But without new physical evidence, progress stalled. And then something happened that gave the case a brief, painful jolt. In September of that same year, months after Brian vanished, Alexis called his phone again before going to sleep. By then, it had become a ritual, something between hope and habit. This time, the phone rang. Not voicemail. It rang. 3 times. For a moment, everything changed. Because a ringing phone means connection. It means the device is active. It means it is somewhere within reach of a network. Alexis kept calling just to hear it again. Later, records showed a signal had pinged off a tower in Hilliard, several miles away from where Brian was last seen. But just like everything else in this case, even that moment refused to settle into certainty. The service provider suggested it could have been a glitch, a delayed network response, a technical anomaly, something that feels real in the moment, but cannot be proven. And so, the case returned to where it always seemed to land, unresolved. As years passed, another kind of narrative began to take shape, not from police, but from people watching the case from the outside. Some believed Brian had died that night, the victim of foul play that left no trace. Some believed he had left voluntarily, choosing to disappear and start over somewhere else. And some believed something more complicated had happened, something involving people who knew more than they had said. That last idea kept pulling attention back toward one person. Clint Florence, Brian's friend, the man who had been with him that night. Clint had cooperated with police early on. He had told his story, repeated it, maintained consistency, but he had refused to take a polygraph. Again, legally, that meant nothing. But emotionally, to the people closest to Brian, it meant something. Derek Shaffer would later say he believed Clint knew more than he had shared. Not necessarily that he was responsible, but that he held something back, something that could explain what happened. Alexis felt something similar. Not a clear accusation, just a sense that pieces were missing. But without evidence, those feelings could not move the case forward. They just stayed there, unresolved. And then, 2 years after Brian disappeared, the case was hit with another tragedy. Randy Shaffer died. He was in his yard during a storm, clearing debris, when a tree branch fell and struck him. He was found the next day. In the span of a few years, the Shaffer family had lost a mother, a son to disappearance, and then the father who had refused to stop searching. That moment changed the emotional weight of the case, because Randy had been one of the strongest voices keeping the investigation alive. And now he was gone too. After his death, something strange appeared online. A condolence message. Simple, short. To Dad, love Brian. It was posted from a public computer. For a moment, it reignited everything. Because if Brian was alive, if he had seen the message, why would he stay hidden? Why would he not come forward? Why would he allow his family to continue living in uncertainty? Investigators tracked it down. It was a hoax. And in cases like this, hoaxes don't just mislead investigations. They hurt people. They reopen wounds that never fully closed. By the time the case reached the 10-year mark, it had settled into something familiar in the world of unsolved disappearances. A file that is never closed. A case that still receives tips. A mystery that refuses to resolve. Police continue to receive calls, leads, possible sightings. None of them changed the core facts. Brian walked into the ugly Tuna Saloona. He was seen on camera. He stepped out of frame. And after that, nothing that could be proven. But time does not just pass quietly. It brings new tools, new ways of looking at old evidence. Across the world, cold cases began to be solved using advances in technology. DNA analysis improved. Databases expanded. Facial recognition tools became more refined. In 2021, authorities released an age-progressed image of Brian. He was no longer the 27-year-old medical student frozen in posters. He was older, different, a version of him that might exist somewhere, or might not. That image served two purposes. It asked the public to keep looking, and it quietly acknowledged something else, that this case had crossed from immediate investigation into long-term uncertainty. Some investigators have hinted over the years that they believe Brian may still be alive. Others believe the truth is far more tragic. But officially, the case remains open, unsolved, suspended between possibilities. And that is where the tension begins to build again. Because when a case refuses to resolve, it creates space for one final question. Not just what happened, but what is most likely to have happened. Did Brian leave that building through a route nobody noticed? Did something happen inside, hidden in the chaos of closing time? Did someone know more than they ever revealed? Or did Brian make a decision that night that erased him from his old life completely? The answers are not just missing. They are competing with each other. And that makes the final part of this case even more complicated. Because there is no confirmed ending. Only theories. Only interpretations. Only pieces that don't quite fit together. And when we reach the end, you're going to have to decide which version of the truth you believe. Comment below. Do you think Brian is still alive somewhere? Or do you believe something irreversible happened that night? There is no arrest in this case. No trial. No confession. No body recovered. And that changes everything. Because most true crime stories move toward an answer. Even if it takes years, even if it takes decades, there is usually a point where the truth surfaces, where the story shifts from mystery to explanation. Brian Randall Shaffer's case never makes that turn. Instead, it leaves you standing in the same place investigators have been standing since that night in 2006, looking at the same limited pieces, trying to force them into a shape that makes sense. So the only way to understand what likely happened is to walk through the possibilities, not as speculation, but as structured reality. The first possibility is the one most people instinctively believe, that Brian left the building and something happened to him outside. For this to be true, he would have had to use an exit that avoided the main camera. The service route is the most discussed option. It leads into a construction area, then out into a different part of the complex. If Brian took that path, it would explain why he does not appear on the main exit footage. But it creates a new problem. Once outside, where did he go? Because investigators checked surrounding cameras, nearby businesses, streets, other bars. There is no confirmed footage of Brian anywhere after that moment. So for this theory to hold, one of two things must also be true. Either he moved through areas with no camera coverage at all, or something happened to him very quickly after he exited. An encounter, a confrontation, an opportunity, something fast enough, contained enough, that it left no witnesses and no physical evidence that could be tied back to him. That is possible, but it relies heavily on absence. Absence of footage, absence of witnesses, absence of trace, and absence is difficult to prove. The second possibility is more uncomfortable, that something happened inside or immediately around the bar complex itself, not necessarily inside the main public area, but within the structure, in a space not fully visible, in a moment not fully captured. For this to be true, Brian would not have needed to leave in the conventional sense. He could have entered a restricted area. He could have encountered someone near that service corridor. He could have moved into a part of the building that was not being monitored clearly. But again, this theory faces its own problem. Searches were conducted, multiple times, extensively. Nothing was found. No physical evidence. No hidden remains. No indication of a violent event within the building. So while this theory explains the missing exit, it struggles against the lack of discovery. The third possibility is the one that divides people the most. That Brian chose to disappear. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a planned, cinematic sense. But in a quiet, deliberate shift. Walk away. Start over. Erase the old life. At first, this theory seems unlikely. He left behind everything. His car. His belongings. His relationship. His family. His future. He missed a planned trip. He stopped all contact. There was no financial trail. No confirmed identity shift. No evidence of preparation. But supporters of this theory point to something else. Timing. Brian had just lost his mother. He was under pressure in medical school. He had talked about wanting a different kind of life. Music, travel, escape. In rare cases, people do walk away. They step out of their existing life and build a new one somewhere else. But here's the problem. Those cases almost always leave a trace. A sighting, a record, a mistake, something. Brian's case does not. Which means if he did leave voluntarily, he did it perfectly. And perfect disappearances are extremely rare. The fourth possibility is not a separate theory. It is a complication. That someone else knows more than they have ever said. Not necessarily that they committed a crime, but that they hold a piece of the timeline that has never been fully revealed. This is where attention often returns to Clint Florence. Again, not because there is direct evidence tying him to wrongdoing, but because of proximity. Because he was there. Because he was one of the last people to see Brian. Because he refused a polygraph. Because those closest to Brian believe there are unanswered questions. Law enforcement has never publicly named him as a suspect. And without evidence, that matters. But in unresolved cases, absence of evidence does not stop people from asking questions. It only keeps those questions from being answered. So where does that leave us? With 4 core possibilities. Brian left, and something happened outside. Something happened inside or near the building. He left voluntarily, or someone holds a missing piece of the truth, and none of them can be confirmed. That is the reality of this case. Not mystery for the sake of storytelling, but a real, unresolved absence. A man who should have been visible, who wasn't. A timeline that should have been complete, that isn't. A life that should have continued, that stopped in a way nobody can explain. And then there is the impact. Brian's disappearance did not just leave questions. It changed people. His family spent years searching, hoping, trying to hold on to something that could bring clarity. His father fought to keep the case alive, only to pass away without ever knowing what happened to his son. His brother continues to speak about him, to keep his name present in a world that moves on quickly. His girlfriend was left with a moment frozen in time, a relationship that never got an ending. And beyond the family, the case left something else behind. A standard, a reminder that even in a crowded place, with cameras, with witnesses, with structure, a person can still disappear completely. Now I want to ask you something, because this case does not give us a clean answer. It gives us a choice. Which version of events do you believe makes the most sense? Do you think Brian left that building alive and encountered something outside? Do you believe the truth is hidden somewhere inside the structure he was last seen in? Do you think he chose to walk away from everything and start over? Or do you believe someone knows exactly what happened and has never said it? Drop your answers in the comments. I'm reading every single one, because this is one of those cases where the truth is not just missing, it's contested. And the more people look at it, the more it forces you to decide what you think really happened. And here is the part that stays with people long after the video ends. Brian Shaffer did not vanish in the wilderness. He did not disappear on an empty road. He disappeared in a place filled with people, in a space where cameras were running, in a moment where nothing looked out of the ordinary. And somehow, that was enough for him to be gone forever. No confirmed exit, no confirmed path, no confirmed ending, just a final image. A man standing outside a bar, talking, turning, stepping out of frame, and then nothing. If cases like this matter to you, the ones that don't resolve, the ones that leave questions behind, the ones that show how fragile certainty really is, subscribe. Turn on notifications. We release new cases every day at 9 p.m. Comment your location below so more people can find these stories. Because Brian Shaffer's case is still open, and sometimes the only thing that keeps a case alive is people refusing to forget it.